The Balfour Declaration was sanctioned by major Allied powers, particularly Great Britain, which incorporated it into its mandate for Palestine after World War I. This declaration that was issued in 1917 was formally approved by the newly created League of Nations on July 24, 1922. However, in May of 1939, the British government changed its policy in what is known as the White Paper of 1939. The Zionists vehemently condemned Britain for trying to back out of the agreement and accused Britain of favoring the Arabs. But what caused the British Mandatory Palestine policy to go up in flames? The 1920s and 1930s were a time of tension in Palestine. Under British rule, due to the League of Nations mandate system, this period saw conflicting developments between emerging Palestinian nationalism and the ever-expanding infrastructure for a Jewish state. When paired with anti-British sentiments amongst the Arab population, conflict was seemingly inevitable. Indeed, all these factors culminated in the Arab Revolt of 1936 through 1939. So how did the British come to control Palestine? Well, after World War I, the United Kingdom came to control Palestine under the League of Nations mandate system. The supposed aim of this system was to guide political entities that were not yet ready for statehood toward independence. However, during the war, the British also promised the Jews a state in Palestine via the Balfour Declaration. This meant that there were competing Jewish and Palestinian national identities during this mandate period. Tensions initially flared in the 1929 Wailing Wall riots, which saw violent protests by both the Jews and Arabs, as well as violent measures to quell the protests by the British. Despite initially seeming that some of the promises of the Balfour Declaration would be scaled back due to these riots, pressure from the Jewish Agency in London caused these plans to be reversed. When paired with increased Jewish immigration to Palestine in 1939, following the rise of the Nazis, as well as building anger towards the British due to their colonial practices, this set the stage for more Arab unrest. The British wanted to get to the root cause of the revolt, so they launched a commission. It was led by Robert Peel. The report stated that the mandate was the root of the problem and it needed to end. Fostering two different nationalist movements in the same territory had proved to be a problem, and the report recommended a land partition. The Peel Partition Plan aimed to create as much territorial continuity as possible for the proposed Jewish state. However, separating the Arab and Jewish populations on the ground was impossible, meaning that the Jewish state would have only had a 55% Jewish majority. Therefore, there were talks of population transfers. Furthermore, since the Jewish state would have received most of the agriculturally viable land and the best infrastructure, the Peel Commission concluded that the Arab state should enter into a federation with Jordan. Once the Arab population heard about these plans, violent unrest reignited in the second half of 1937, lasting until 1939, when the British regained control through the usage of draconian martial law measures. Indeed, by the end of the revolt, 1 in 10 Palestinian leaders had been killed. The British created yet another commission in 1938, known as the Woodhead Commission. It stated that the Peel partition plan was not feasible due to the impossibility of enacting a voluntary population transfer. This thus led to the White Paper in May of that same year, which stated that Jewish immigration would be limited to 75,000 for the next 5 years, after which it would be subject to the decision of the Arab majority. Furthermore, Jewish land purchases were to be restricted to particular areas of Palestine. But something happened to change all of that. World War II was a landmark event in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The enormous geopolitical shift caused by the Holocaust turbocharged plans to create a Jewish state in Palestine. This ultimately resulted in 2 wars in the region: a civil war in Mandate Palestine from November 1947 to May 1948, and another from May 1948 to March 1949 between the newly created State of Israel and a coalition of Arab states. After the 1917 British document that assured the facilitation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine started to unravel, the mass erasure of Jews in Europe had enormous ramifications for plans to create a Jewish state. The immense number of Jewish refugees after World War II, paired with international sympathy regarding Jewish suffering, caused plans for the creation of a Jewish state to be reignited. In particular, the United States pressured the United Kingdom to allow for more Jewish immigration to Palestine, reluctant to do so due to their promises to restrict Jewish immigration. In the 1939 White Paper, the British abdicated responsibility to the newly created United Nations. The UN put together a committee to deal with Palestine. Named the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, it concluded that partition was necessary. Thus, on November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted the partition plan created by the committee. It functioned as follows. Palestine was to be divided into 7 areas, 3 for the Jews, 3 for the Arabs, and the 7th, Jerusalem, was to be under international control. The proposed Arab state comprised 42% of the territory, the Jewish state 56%, and the international zone made up the remaining 2%. Crucially, there was no actual international enforcement of this partition plan on the ground, leaving the 2 sides to figure it out for themselves. This set the stage for violence. A civil war between the Arabs and Jews broke out soon after the partition plan was adopted. Despite the overwhelming size advantage of the combined Arab armies, Israel managed to beat them back. Indeed, the IDF was well organized and with memories of the Holocaust fresh in Israelis' minds. The soldiers were also highly motivated. Furthermore, since the Arab states were recently independent, their armies were new, poorly trained, and lacking motivation, making them largely ineffective. Hence, Between February and July 1949, armistice agreements were reached between Israel and the Arab states. By the end of the war, Israel occupied 78% of the former Mandate Palestine, leaving 22% to the Palestinian Arabs. Moreover, between 650,000 and 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, approximately half of the Palestinian Arab population, were displaced. The history of the 1947 through 1949 wars has been highly contested. The conventional Zionist perspective and the one taught in Israeli schools in the decades following the country's founding is that these were wars for independence fought in the aftermath of the attempted extermination of their people in Europe. This perspective also posits that the Palestinians willingly fled from their homes during the war. However, the new historians, a term coined by Benny Morris in 1988 to describe a group of Israeli historians challenging this nationalist perspective, criticizes this narrative, utilizing newly available primary sources to highlight the role that the Israeli army played in expelling the Palestinians. Finally, from the Palestinian perspective, these wars resulted in the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe, the purposeful ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population from their homeland. But is there even more to this story? The Mosaic says there is a forgotten truth about the Balfour Declaration. For 100 years, the British statement, which inaugurated Zionism's legitimation in the eyes of the world, has been seen as the isolated act of a single nation. The truth is much different. So who were these additional partners? Their contribution has been largely forgotten, but when the fuller story is told, the Balfour Declaration looks very different. It is no longer a British imperial grab, but the outcome of a carefully constructed consensus of the leading democracies of the day. It is no longer in tension with the principle of self-determination, but a statement made possible by the very champion of the principle. And it is no longer an emanation of secret dealings, but one of the first instances of public diplomacy. It is, in short, not a throwback to the 19th century, but an opening to the 20th. The key to understanding the fuller story is this. In regard to Palestine, Britain could not have acted alone, because it belonged to an alliance. The Allied powers, especially Britain and France, but also Russia, Italy, and later America, were fighting together. Their policies had to be coordinated. It would have been unthinkable for Britain to have issued a public pledge regarding the future of territory yet to be taken in war without the prior assent of its wartime allies, especially those that also had an interest in Palestine.